Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Hartzacker from IAB Europe, and thank you for dialing in today. We're going to be presenting the tech spec called Pubvendors.json, which is a new addition to the Transparency and Consent framework, and that'll be followed by a demonstration of Predesto's CMP that will be presented by Imran Akbar and Mo Momin, and we hope to end with about 20 minutes of Q&A. You can submit your questions on the questions pane, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And we're joined by Noga Rosenthal from Epsilon Conversant, who will be helping out with the policy questions, and Heinz Baumann, who's presenting the Pubvendors.json tech spec, will be there to answer any more technical-sided questions. So feel free to ask anything that may have come up in your mind. And with that, all I have to say is I'll hand over to Heinz Baumann from Quantcast, who's going to explain this Pubvendors.json file.
Hello, everybody. I'm Heinz. I'm with Quantcast. I'm a senior manager of engineering in the publisher team here at Quantcast, and I'm leading the content manager GDPR initiative at Quantcast as well, and was one of the people who designed that transparency consent framework that we have today in IAB. Next slide, please. What we're going to talk about is the Pubvendor.json spec. This is a new edition. Quickly tell you kind of what the problem is, what the solution is, how to integrate, what to know about this, the timeline we have, and then if there are any questions, we can either do this there or at the end of this session today. If you go to the next slide, please. So before diving into the Pubvendors.json, which is an addition to the framework, I want to quickly, for those of you who may not so familiar with the framework, go give an elevator pitch of what this standard framework actually is and why we did this. So key things: transparency for consumers and publishers, to support the regulation, have control for the publishers over the partners operating on the site, control for consumers so they can control who can use their data, which is one of the most important things, consent as a potential legal basis, standardization across publishers and partners so we can operate and communicate effectively and create an open source standard. That's what this IAB transparency and consent framework actually is. Flexibility for publishers and all the web hosts and demand sources to build or work with various consent management providers, and minimize disruption across the internet, benefiting customers, consumers, publishers, and all supporting vendors. So what we created is a framework that consists of a JSON specification, a JavaScript specification that specifies the consent manager core API set that everybody can, as a web host, can add to their web page. That doesn't matter who is the actual consent manager, can implement and then listen to and bring up a content manager. And everybody who has access to the web page and want to place an ad can use the same framework and the standardized API call to check whether consent has been given or not. The other part of this framework is a bitstring that was created that contains all the information. It contains information about the purposes that have been consented for. It gives the list of all the vendors that have been consented for and additional metadata information that's needed downstream. And that bitstring can be passed along from vendor to vendor so that everybody knows whether I have got consent from the user on that call, even though that I may not have direct access to the user. And what we found was that there was some shortcomings with that bitstring and the mechanism, and publishers specifically have asked for a little more control. And if we just jump to the next slide, please. Specifically, publishers and any web hosts that are concerned around liability. How can they make sure that they're not getting liable on something that happens by a vendor? So they ask for a little more control over this. In order to do this, before I go there, what they had was they approached us and they asked, we want to protect ourselves and our customers to not be exposed to vendors that we don't actually work with. And they also want to control what type of purposes are allowed. And they want to be able to, they want to do a way so they can configure which purpose and which vendors can actually be presented to the actual user through the content manager. So we go to the next slide. So what we created is we want to provide a standard for publishers that they can declare the vendors that they work with and the permission and configuration, allow vendors to verify publishers' GDPR settings and verify and audit CMP content strings, provide standard way for publishers to whitelist vendors, enable publishers to limit purposes on a per vendor basis, and enable publishers to limit features on a per vendor basis. The two additional bullet items is something that the bitstream doesn't support today. We need another mechanism to do that. The current thinking is that this configuration is an optional feature to the IAB transparency and consent framework. So if a publisher doesn't, is okay with the defaults, they actually don't need to put it in. But if somebody wants to restrict it more, I want to take over control, they can actually do this. Currently, this is a specification on the review, so it's currently out for input, and I'm getting to this in a second. So we go to the next slide, please. So what we came up with is a JSON file that the publisher or any web host can place on their domain. And I'm getting into the detail how to actually do this so it's consistent in one of the next slides. So basically that gives an out-of-band signal to signal the vendors and the CMPs. The CMPs can read this, so we know what limitation the publisher puts on that we can show inside the CMP, and the vendors can crawl the domains to find this file to get additional information around what the publisher has potentially restricted. If we go to the next slide, please. That talks a little more about the integration. There's 3 areas. As I mentioned, the publisher can place that file on their well-known path on their domain, and the example is right there. And then the CMPs know where to read this from, and when vendors crawl the page, they know where to find this. Then the CMPs, they can check for this, as I mentioned, and then use this to filter out the list of vendors they present to the users. And then the SSPs and DSPs, they can use the Pubvendors.json to augment the content string they're receiving by crawling the publisher side. So you get the content string, but you can also go and check for this call, whether for this publisher, whether you have Pubvendors.json and whether the publisher put additional restrictions on myself as a vendor. If we continue to the next slide, please. I think these are kind of a few more details. So we have in the spec, we call it the version 1.0 and the version 1.1. The version 1.0 is basically just here to support the CMPs. What we found out when we started discussing this is that everybody in the commit group who is providing a CMP solution already thought about providing a way to whitelist or blacklist vendors. And when we talked about this, we decided, instead of everybody doing their own thing, let's just agree on a standard for just that purpose, and we push this out right away. So that's where we created this kind of version 1. It sounds a little funky that we have a specification that we're on the review map version 1 and version 1.1 already. But this is, we want to get this part of the specification out immediately so the CMPs can actually use this right away and document this so that when they work with their publishers, they can start using it. And we already have a file in the right place with the right format that just can be expanded when the specification is actually approved. So can be immediately be used. There's the example here on the screen that basically just give you some metadata on the header and then the list of the vendors, and the IDs correspond to the IDs in the global vendor list, and they can enable this. So this is a whitelist that it basically enables, I want to have these vendors with these IDs that I want to provide to that I work with, and that's what the user should see instead of seeing the gazillion of vendors that are in the global vendor list. And it enables the vendors to rely on a legitimate interest as well. So there is another purpose for this, so they can actually, the vendors can actually as well use on this. So if you go to the next slide, which is really kind of the meat of kind of the bigger change. So that's where kind of the proposal is, and that's where we need input during the review period. So this gives the power to the web host, could be a publisher, marketer, based on how they work with the vendor to override what the vendor provided in the global vendor list. So they can say, I want to, I have vendor 1, let's say this is Quantcast. Quantcast specified the global vendor list, and purposes, we enabled all the purposes, and the vendor, the publisher has a contract with Quantcast and said, no, that, you know, this is not right. I only give allow purposes 1, 2, and 3, so they can overwrite this through this file, and then Quantcast can go and crawl this information, crawl the file on the domain, get the information, and then we know we only have rights for 1, 2, and 3, and not for 4 and 5. So that's one thing to do, and this can be specified for each individual vendor. And there is another option that disable upstream vendors. This disables to pull in additional vendors from the global vendor list. So if I, as a publisher, have and most of them probably have a list of vendors that I'm working with, and I have them all listed, I really don't worry about anything new added to the global vendor list. I can actually signal this through this file and say, I don't want to have any new global vendor list being pulled in. We go to the next slide, please. One of the parts that we do along with this, we're updating the global vendor list to expand the purpose control. We're adding in a new purposes field that you can specify, and you can say whether the legal basis is consent or legitimate interest. That's something that currently we don't have clearly specified. It's assumed that if basically currently it's assumed that if it's not listed as a consent purpose in the global vendor list, that the vendor can use legitimate interest. This one actually specifies it clear, so we can actually audit this, and everybody will know whether these on the which legal basis the vendor is actually working on each individual purpose. So we have that in here, and then there is an other field called required, an optional field that signals the external parties if a specific purpose is required for a vendor to operate. The majority will probably just have the purpose and then the legal basis in there. So that's a change to the global vendor list that will come. And if we go to the next slide, I think this is the last additional change, is change the content string protocol. The content string based on this proposal, should be modified to pass the version of the Pubvendors.json used when sending the request, so that it actually can be matched up, because the publisher can update his file and it should have a version number, and we want to know which one to look at if there's multiple files there. The file version can be used by downstream parties to determine if they have an up-to-date version of the file when processing requests. So the idea is you don't have to crawl all the time. The idea is you crawl, on a whatever schedule that you put up. But if we have this in the consent string, then you actually know whether you need to go back and refetch a file or not, because you make crawled ones and you have the information. I have news now and I have that file and it's version 1, and now I get a consent string, and I see there's a new version number 2 available, so I know I actually have to go and get an updated version because there's no additional information I have to look into. That's what that purpose is for that change. And if we go to the next slide, timeline. So as I mentioned, this is currently under review. The IAB Tech Lab put this out, and there is a link. I think there's 2 places this can be viewed, but this is the link in the GitHub that I actually have. And as I mentioned, the Pubvendors.json version 1.0 that you find in this specification is available for immediate use by the CMPs. This just basically gives a way for the CMPs to have a whitelist if they want to support that, and in a consistent way. And then the 1.1, which is all the free changes, that the purposes that can be specified in the vendors JSON, and the global vendor list update, and the string, the consent string update is under review, and the review cycle ends June 1st. So everybody, please go look at this and give feedback on this, whether this makes any sense, whether this can be done differently, or whatnot. I think we will be open to get, actually we are looking forward to get everybody's feedback on this. And let's go jump to the next slide, which I think is already the Q&A slide. Yes, this is the little guy, totally confused, doesn't know what to do. Questions?
Yeah, so the way we normally do this is we do the Q&A at the end, so we don't risk going over the time of the other presenters. So I'm going to hand over now the presenter privileges to Imran Akbar from Predesto, and him and Mo Baumann will give a explanation of their CMP and a demonstration.
Thanks a lot, everybody. And just while Imran sets up, I just want to wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Mo Baumann. Thanks a lot, Chris, for introducing us. I'm the CEO of Predesto, and we are a CMP based out of Palo Alto, California. And maybe just pause here and ask Imran to quickly introduce himself.
Yes, hey everyone, I'm the CTO. I've been working on the CMP and GDPR compliance for almost a year now, so excited to get this up and running, and I just wanted to say thank you to the IAB and our partners at Comscore as well.
Yeah, so Chris and Matthias from IAB, thanks a lot for your support, and also for Comscore for having already tested our solution and provided some pretty good feedback. So we've been working on, thinking about GDPR compliance and the implications on the ad tech space for a good part of the past year. And really as we're thinking about the solution that we put together, we're thinking about how we can best support publishers and vendors and their business objectives while mitigating their legal risk, and of course, respecting user rights according to the GDPR. And so there's a lot of different layers to that objective, and hence it became very clear to us that there are a lot of different players involved in this space, a lot of different stakeholders, and a solution that would truly work from a CMP perspective would have to respect all of those objectives in a collaborative manner. So Imran, if you mind going to the next slide. So the big concern, obviously, from players in the ad tech space is if we need consent in order to provide, in order to serve targeted ads, then without consent, we're not able to serve relevant ads to users on publisher sites. And obviously that restricts revenue potential as users are perhaps less likely to click on advertising and therefore generating less revenue. And if we go to the next slide. Now, if we require consent from users to serve relevant ads, there are some challenges in order to obtain that consent. Obviously, from a publisher's side, obtaining consent is something that the GDPR is asking for, and as I mentioned, that can threaten advertising revenues. But it's not just obtaining consent on for your own cookies, but it's also essentially a requirement to obtain consent on behalf of the partners and the ad networks that you work with. And from the ad networks and partners side, as data controllers, they will also require consent for how they take on data and process data. But they don't necessarily interact directly with the users, and therefore they will have to collaborate with the publishers in order to get the consent that they require. So it's essentially a problem with collaboration and how we essentially make sure that publishers, ad networks, and their partners are able to work together to obtain that consent in a way that's not too invasive for users and ruins the user experience. Next slide, Imran, please. So if I had to use one phrase for how we describe ourselves, we think of ourselves as sort of a central repository for user consent. And what I mean by that is we essentially play a bridging role between the users, publishers, and their networks and partners. So we have a customizable banner, and we'll quickly walk through a demo after this, through which we request consent from users, who hopefully then provide consent. And then we also log and transfer that consent so that it's available not only to publishers, but also for their ad networks and partners. And our central repository essentially is a real-time, updates user consent status in real time, given that users can always, withdraw consent at any given point in time. But really our solution is, targeted towards the publishers, towards the ad networks, and is aims to keep the user experience a relatively positive one as we obtain consent. And the next slide, Imran, please. Where we see our benefits or distinct benefits in this space is we're pretty comprehensive. So we have a solution, we have a web solution, we have a pixel tag solution when it comes to obtaining consent, and we're currently in beta testing for a mobile app consent solution as well. We see ourselves as quite scalable and reliable, so we're built on AWS. We're scalable horizontally, so we feel we're already ready to handle millions of requests per day. And we also have automatic failover and daily database backups. And finally, we're pretty flexible. So we offer multi-site support with a single account, multi-language support, which you'll see in the demo, multiple designs, which you'll also see in the demo, and then finally webhook integrations to hundreds of cloud apps. And this was a solution, as I mentioned, that we've been working on for the past year, and have been really working closely with publishers and vendors and collected feedback. So what we're going to show you in a second is really based on what we've heard from you guys on the ground, and we'd love to continue getting feedback as you guys have a look through the demo. So before we go through the demo, I just wanted to quickly let you guys know that after the presentation, if you want to get in touch, feel free to email me at mo@predesto.com. And we're happy to answer questions or get any feedback or comments. So with that, I'll hand over to Imran so that he can walk us through a demo of our product and our solution.
Thanks, Mo. I'm just going to start by demoing something that the IAB is still sort of finalizing, and that's the consent for URL-based services and pixel tags. And so the way that works is if I just switch over to this other tab right here. So the way this works is that for pixel tags and other things which do not have the ability to run JavaScript in the browser, you would simply issue a redirect call to our URL, and you would pass in the domain name that you eventually want to redirect to. And what this does is that when the browser requests this, it'll pass along any consent cookies that have already been granted by the user. And so in this case, if I make this request, what's going to happen is that you'll notice it's redirected me to the BBC, and it's added in these extra parameters. So there's a flag for GDPR right there, and there's also the actual cookie string from my browser's cookies, which has been passed along in the GDPR consent parameter. And so this is still somewhat in beta. There's some questions about this particular flag and how we're going to flag whether a particular user is in the European Union or not, based on their IP address, which is a bit tricky because that in itself may require consent. But this is sort of the solution for pixel tags. It's a really straightforward 302 redirect, and it's flexible and really straightforward. If you're interested in how that works, this is the framework. It's listed on the IAB's GitHub page, and that's one part of our solution for pixel tags. I'm just going to switch screens here now and switch to the So this is our dashboard. Once you log in, this is what the publishers would see. This is the place where they can see how many visitors have come to their sites, what % of them have consented to their privacy framework, and if we have received any revoke requests, what the status is of those. On the left side, you have a few things in the sidebar. We have a consent log. We can keep track of all the consents that have been granted as a publisher. We monitor all the various sites that you may own. We've spoken to publishers who have literally thousands of sites, and so this tool is designed to help them monitor compliance for all those sites. And then we have the setup and settings where you actually go in to set up your consent banner for your websites. So I'll just walk through these one by one. I already have these open in tabs. So this is the consent log. So what you're seeing here is both the number of consents in a chart at the top that you've received over the past month. And then for each consent, we just show the most recent 10 or so consents, just so you can make sure that it's working and that you can demonstrate consent to regulators and for your documentation purposes. In addition to this view, we also provide raw SQL access to our data warehouse if you need to. But what you can see here is we've got the timestamp of each consent, the hashed IP address. This is the hashing we're using here is HMAC hashing, so it's actually not just the IP address, it's also a secret key combined. So even if you took all 6 billion IP addresses or whatever and tried to find matches to these, you wouldn't be able to because we have that extra secret key as well. So it really is truly anonymized. In addition, we have the URL and the domain it came from, and then you have the final you have the list of vendors and purposes they have consented to. Let me just mouse over this. Yeah. And so that's sort of the consent log for compliance and documentation purposes. The next tab that I'll open is sort of the monitoring tab. So right here, we've got essentially a daily scan of all your websites as a publisher that you want to maintain compliance for. And so what we do is once a day, we crawl the website, just the homepage. We look at which vendors are present on the site, and we have them displayed along with whichever cookies are being dropped on the site. And we maintain, we check to see if any consent banner is visible on the site. So this is a quick way to just maintain compliance over all your sites, see where you have some issues and with things that you need to fix in terms of vendors that you may not be collecting consent for, but are present on the site. This is a challenge for many publishers who have large numbers of sites, because their developers are often making changes every single day, either removing certain vendors or adding certain vendors. So this just helps you keep things in sync and keep control over things. Finally, we've got sort of the consent settings and setup tab. So here, what you can do is, as you can see, we support multiple sites. So you can type in any domain name here and click Get Settings. And once that's done, you'll see the display at the bottom. So you can go and set the privacy policy URL for this particular site. Down here, we've got all the list of IAB vendors. It's searchable. So let's say we want to enable Criteo, you just go in and click Enabled right here. And once you have that, at the bottom, you have available language translations for the banner itself. We have some pre-built text here, but you can customize this as you see fit. And finally, at the bottom, we have some optional settings in terms of what type of design you would like to use and whether you'd like to just hide the vendor details until the customer requests it or just display those by default. In addition, we also support Do Not Track in all modern browsers. And down here at the bottom, we've set up a webhook URL. So anytime a consent comes in, we can send a copy to this webhook URL and from there on to any cloud application set up through Zapier. So once you have that, you'll see at the top here the JavaScript that you can copy and paste, embed into a website. And I'll just show you that in a second. That's in a separate tab. So this is now what a consumer would see. So this is just a demo web page we've set up. So this is, some tourism site, let's say, with a bunch of pictures of Paris. Once we put that JavaScript code on the page, it'll look more like this. So this is the condensed version of the banner where we're not showing all the details until we click on it. Once the user clicks on it, we can show, we've basically grouped all the vendors by their purposes and listed using the icon or the logo of the vendor. When you mouse over the vendor, you can see the name of the vendor. You can choose to disable consent for that vendor specifically or for the entire use case. The other option and the other design we have is on the next tab. So this is where we display all the vendors by default, and we're using a different styling here where we display every purpose and every vendor by default with the full text. And again, you can just click accept here, and the next time I refresh the page, it won't pop up again because it's already stored that consent once. So that's just a quick overview from the publisher side, the web application that we've got for them to set up all their websites, as well as the consumer-facing consent widgets, and finally the URL-based pixel tag consent management. So I think that's all we had for the demo. Happy to turn it back over.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm going to do something as the presenter, which isn't very nice, but I have to just promote our annual conference, which is happening in 2 weeks. And one of the big things that we want to make a part of this conference is to talk about the GDPR more, especially since the day after the conference ends is the 25th of May. So we have a panel on this exact transparency consent framework, which includes folks from AppNexus, Quantcast, MediaMath, OneTrust, and will be moderated by our CEO. Summer is Heinz's colleague. So she's also been very involved in the framework, and Alice and Julia have been working on this since day one as well. And for the rest of our conference, we have a few GDPR and policy side panels. So that includes 2 trainings, one of which will be given by myself and my colleague Matthias, and a main stage panel, as I said. We're also doing a live stream Q&A with the European Data Protection Supervisor, and there will be an interview with an MEP from the European Conservative Group who has worked on the e-privacy regulation. So with that out of the way, we can head into questions. I'm just going to put this slide up for a second To remind you that we have a website, advertisingconsent.eu. Most of you will know that because that's probably why you've received the invitation for this email, for this webinar. And just to make sure to check that every now and then, we try to keep it as up to date as possible, and we update the list of registered vendors and CMPs as often as we physically can. So there's always more information there. Probably if you haven't checked it in a week's time, there will be more. The links that we were shown earlier by Heinz, for example, should be available there as well. So I already see we have quite a large amount of questions. I'm going to take the first two together since they were tabled by Timothy Brown quite close to each other, which is, first of all, when are we expecting the mobile app framework to be available for use in the market? So in the first instance, I should say, with the release of the Pubvendors.json file, we also released mobile in-app specifications out for public consultation. And that consultation ends on the same day as the Pubvendors one. And the other thing I want to note there is that next week we will have somebody on to talk exactly about the mobile in-app specifications. So if you have the same time available next week, please join and you'll get an explanation. If not, a recording of that should be up on the website the week after that. And then the other question was, are Google going to be on the vendor list? We can't answer that for Google. Currently, they have not registered themselves as a vendor. Is there anything you want to add about the mobile app framework, Heinz, or shall we just continue?
Yeah, since you have a webinar about the mobile framework next week, there's probably all the details, but yeah, there is a spec out that can be reviewed. And I encourage everybody in the mobile space to look at this. It had a drastic change in direction in the last few weeks before we finished the specification. And so, yeah, please take a look at the spec that's available, and it's on that advertisingconsent.eu page. You can actually find the link to it.
Yeah. Okay. So question came in from Blake Brannon asking, does the publisher build the JSON file, the pubvendors.json file themselves? I suppose that would be for you, Heinz.
Yes. So at this point, I would say yes. There's a spec, and then you follow the spec to write it. We at Quantcast, we have on our webpage for what we call QC Choice, which is the CMP that we have. We actually have a portal where you can do like similar what you saw from the demo you saw before. We have a portal you can actually set up the tag you need for our CMP, and on that there is going to be also a way for publishers to have a WYSIWYG UI to generate that JSON file. But at this point, yes, the publishers will have to go ahead and actually, based on the model, what's in the spec, and build it out themselves.
Okay, thanks, Heinz. So a question that maybe you can answer, Noga, is how does a company become part of this global list of vendors? Is it something that IAB members are a part of by default?
Sure. So Chris, it's not a list that you become a part of by default. You do need to sign up. On the advertising, I want to make sure I have the URL right. The advertisingconsent.edu. There is a place to sign up under vendors and CMPs. Again, it's advertisingconsent.edu, and you do sign up. And so far, we have 140 vendors signed up.
Yep, thanks. So that leads you to a registration portal where you can become a registered vendor after we've made sure that you are who you say you are and are agreed to the policies. Question came in from Anthony Hitchings. Can a publisher build their own cookie consent pages and obey the protocols or spec without becoming a CMP, or is it more of a global consent setting rather than a per user setting? I suppose either Noga or Heinz could take this.
Yeah, so I can. I think there was a couple questions in that question.
Yeah.
So the first part was, can a publisher create their own consent CMP basically? And the answer is yes. Do they need to register as one? Yes, you need to do this because you need to register your subdomain. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So you do have to register.
And what I would say to Heinz is that if you don't, if I'm understanding the question correctly, if you don't register and you don't become, you don't come under the framework, what ends up happening is that we'll all be speaking in different languages. We won't be able to work together to present the consumer with the same message around transparency and consent. And so when we're working together to deliver an ad, my system may not work with your system because we're not under that same framework. And so what will end up happening is that the industry will become fragmented. And so that's one of the, I think from my end, one of the biggest benefits of the IAB framework is that it brings us all together. We're all using common language when speaking to the consumer, including around advertising purposes, whatever they may be, and making that easier for the consumer to understand.
Okay, thanks both. A question came in from Alexander Parastayev. We are talking about specifying particular settings for a vendor that a particular publisher has. For example, if a news site says it doesn't want to share certain information with Quantcast, what about user level controls where a user is actually consenting to data usage and sharing with only certain vendors? I suppose this could be a question also for Predesto, because I think it also speaks more generally to the kind of freedom of how consent and what kind of questions you ask to your users largely depends on the publisher and the CMP that they choose to work with, unless they are the CMP themselves. No takers?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, this is Heinz, I'm just thinking whether I understand the question. So the user has, so the end user has control through the CMP to select which vendors they would like to give consent to. So that's, if they really want to go through that, I would call it very painful exercise and go through the list. If the list grows, we heard we have 140 or something right now. I think in two weeks or so, we're going to have probably gaining 500. And it's going to be, but the user has control to go through this and say, I don't want to work with this and this and this, or they can say, I don't want to work for this purpose, and that should trigger disabling all the vendors who would support that purpose. If so, the user should have full control, and it's really depending on how the content managers implement it. We saw the demo; they have a way to see details where you can actually see all the vendors, and they can actually go and select. The user has control to actually do that. I'm not sure I'm answering the question how it was.
I think it's I think that is more or less what I would have wanted to say as well. The whole point of consent under the GDPR is to give this kind of choice to users. It's the publishers who might have a more specific need to be sure which vendors they are allowing to use data for which purpose. Another question from Anthony Hitchings, there's quite a lot of them. How does this framework work alongside the Your Online Choices website? So which preference would win out if a user opts out at Your Online Choices but also clicks accept and continues via a cookie message from a CMP, or preferences are taken from the Pubvendors.json file?
Chris, I could answer that one because this is a question we've been getting a lot of. So one of the things we're doing is we're logging when the consumer consented and using that timestamp as a way to verify, did they consent first or did they opt out? after giving consent? So do they basically revoke their consent? And that's what we recommend people do, have a timestamp anyway for audit purposes. But that's how we're looking at it.
Yep, thank you very much. And since I already named him, another question from Anthony. Is it possible to allow personalized ads to run in a programmatic sphere where an advertiser has consent, but at the same time not allow any further tracking and profiling from the DSP and advertiser on publisher sites? So that's quite a tricky one. I don't know. Would you have an idea about that, maybe Heinz or Noga? So on the one hand, I think it speaks about data minimization. If you allow them to run an ad through programmatic, but then not allow any further tracking and profiling. What I would say is that you can, or you have to actually present as a publisher or a CMP several purposes. And I believe that some of those purposes would give the user some granularity to indicate that they're okay with one of the aspects and not the other. So they might be okay with ad placement, or and they might be okay with personalization, but not with content personalization. So it would really depend where you would fall within the purposes that are predefined by the framework.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. It's a user could choose. There are 5 purposes. The user could choose to have ads, so being okay with serving ads, but not being okay to profile. Then at that point, the way the ads are served are not going to be the intelligence used to place the ad is going away that way, right? So that's something that basically the quality of what they're going to see is going to go down.
Yep. So on the Pubvendors file specifically, is it an either or for passing on consent? Is it an either or for Pubvendors.json or passing consent in the ad request? Can you use Pubvendors.json for some partners and then the rest are covered by the ad request? Does that question make sense to you, Heinz?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. Yes, is it an and or can I just have some of it in the Pubvendors.json and others through the bit string? So if a Pubvendors.json is defined, then that becomes for that specific publisher, that is going to be the source of truth. So if let's say we have 140 vendors and there are the cookie string comes in or the bit string comes in and all of them are enabled for all the purposes, but then the vendor has in his Pubvendors.json specified only 1 to 20, then only 1 to 20 are really okay to work with. So if you vendor 21, you cannot actually work with this publisher, even though the bit string tells you you have consent, but the publisher overwrote this through the Pubvendors.json.
Okay, and now a question that I'm not sure if anyone has practical information to share. I don't, for example, which is, has anyone started getting consent through the IAB framework already? And if so, do we have any stats?
What is Heinz Quantcast? I think we do. I don't have any stats though. We do have publishers who actually have using our QC choice, and we do see signals coming in, but I do not have any stats.
Same with us, Chris.
Yeah, so just to clarify for those who don't know, both Quantcast as well as Conversant, who Noga works for, have their own CMPs developed as well. They were actually on last week. And they are live on some select websites, I understand. maybe the guys from Predesto could weigh in. Have you guys gone live with your product yet, or is it still in testing?
So we're in the final stages of testing. We're already in discussions with publishers who are looking to use the solution, but we don't have any data at the moment to answer that question.
Okay, thanks. So one thing about our framework is that the people who register to it are CMPs and vendors. So it's hard for us to sometimes have an overview of the actual deployment because we don't have publishers themselves registered within it. So it's a bit hard for us to have an insight into that sometimes. But as we start rolling out, especially with the GDPR coming into force, hopefully we can give you guys some more information on that. A question came in from Blake Brannon again. What is the recommendation on the hostname or path for the vendor.json file? I guess pubvendors.json is what he meant. Is there anything? Yeah.
Yes, so in the spec, there is this, you have it on your domain, and then there's this path that's there. In the spec, it describes that it can also be a redirect, and there is some limitation. I don't have on top of my head the actual details, but the spec actually has it detailed out how this works. It's that location I had in the presentation, and then it can actually have redirects. It's limited to there's a limit on how many redirects you can have, but I think you can actually do that, so you can actually place it in other places. So you don't need to have it on, if you are bbc.com, you don't need to have it on bbc.com/whatever. You can actually redirect it somewhere else if you want. So the spec calls this out in great detail.
Okay, I just want to say we have a lot of questions, so it's unlikely that we'll get to all of them. We will try and incorporate them anyway and answer them through blog posts, or maybe reach out directly if you feel your question wasn't answered. So I'm just going to shoot into this question. It's more of a legal question, I think. Binding legitimate interest to the relationship between the vendor and publisher seems problematic. Legitimate interest, as I understand it, is a legal status applied to a vendor and not to the relationship between a publisher and a vendor. That's by Douglas Campbell. So maybe not, it's more of a comment than a question. Go ahead, Noga.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that just one more time?
Sure. So he says, binding legitimate interest to the relationship between the vendor and publisher seems problematic. As I understand it, legitimate interest is a legal status that is applied to a vendor and not to the relationship between a publisher and vendor.
I don't think that's what we were implying, if I'm understanding the comment correctly. So what we're trying to do, or what companies are trying to do, is that they may use, and I remember the framework is flexible, but what most companies are doing is they're relying on consent as their lawful basis for dropping a cookie on a user's browser. And then any data they collect after that, they're relying on legitimate interest for the collection and use of that data that they collect through the cookie. So it has nothing to do with the relationship between the ad tech company or the vendor and the website. It's legitimate interest is tied to the data collection and use, the processing of that data once the cookie is dropped.
Yeah, I think you cut out a bit at the end, but that's a good point. So essentially, just to clarify, the point of consent or legitimate interest is to justify your data processing. Under the current legal framework, you only technically need consent to drop a cookie on someone's browser or read any information from their devices. So that's something you have to keep in mind, and that's why we have this flexibility in the framework. But the point of it is really just to communicate which legal basis you rely on, rather than determining which one you should. But we have, it might not be that like that on the registration page, but it should be the case that for dropping a cookie, the only acceptable legal basis is consent. I'm going to try and give some questions to Predesto as well, so I might miss some other questions in between. Sorry for that. So a question came in about how does your consent system work for an in-app ecosystem, since you mentioned you're looking to launch a mobile specification.
Yeah, I can sort of take that. We're planning to launch a Java SDK initially for Android, and then follow that up with iOS as well. I'm not sure what they mean by in-app, but I believe we're basically planning to follow the IAB spec in terms of having the similar type of display and then using the shared preferences on Android to sort of share that consent among other apps that may be on the device.
Okay, thanks. And then a question came in from James Brunner, from David Araujo. Is the CMP showing legitimate interest vendors on the UI or only vendors that request consent?
At this point, we're only showing consent, but it's not difficult for us to add legitimate interest as well. It's just a quick UI change mostly. So we can support that.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, we have a lot of questions. I'm just trying to see if I don't miss an important question. If not, I'm going to go back to chronological order. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and it's one that I've seen in various forms. I'm not going to name anyone specific, but for Heinz, with the Pubvendors.json file, if there's any kind of, which I guess the question would be, which information is the kind of definitive information? Should you use the content of the Pubvendors.json file as the final consent signal, no matter what the daisy bit says? Does it override the daisy bit essentially?
The answer is yes, and it should. So it could be if a publisher doesn't list a vendor that is consented in the bit stream in the daisy bit, then the Pubvendors.json information is the source of truth. What the Pubvendors.json file provides you is information of purposes by vendor. That's something that the bit string is not giving you, and so you can actually buy vendor. So the idea behind is really for the publisher to be able to override some of the purposes by vendor. So the Pubvendors.json is the source of truth if this is available, if this is actually given.
Okay, thanks a lot. We've reached the top of the hour. We still have a lot of unanswered questions. Sorry about that. But we will try and figure out a way to answer your questions. I'm putting this website, the slide back up of our website, advertisingconsent.eu. There's a lot of materials that are already there. It's a lot to go through, but we have some FAQ documents which you can hopefully scroll through selectively to find some of the answers you need. And if not, you're always free to reach out to us at IB Europe, and we will try and either answer your question or put you in touch with someone who can answer your question. I'd like to thank Heinz, Imran, Mo, and of course Noga for joining me and providing their expertise. And I will be sending a follow-up with the slides, a recording of the webinar next Monday. So that'll be in your inbox, whether you attended or not. I guess you'll only see this if you see the recording and you didn't attend. But yeah, for those of you where it's later in the day, have a good weekend. And for the rest of you, happy Friday.
Thank you.